not to be too much of the old fart, but 20 years ago, I remember you sending an email to Marty and Jeff Healy and Chris Simpson and saying, I'm interested in these rare conditions. It started off with a first focus on long QT. And I think the way for us to understand this is to work together so that pooling our experience in cases and so on helps us to be able to discover and improve things. And everybody said, this is a great idea. I was writing a heart and stroke grant. And the next step after that was to expand. And I remember waking up one morning thinking, my goal here is to have every Canadian live within 4 hours of an expert or an expert team. And people like Martin Gardner came shortly thereafter and so on. And so it's really heartening to see this. And the next thing that happened was with the sort of inception of this concept of HiRO, where we went away from the kind of physician researcher primary model into the wonderful team and community that we are, was the idea of integrating patients, their families, and the people who provide the care into this wonderful community that we have. And so it's really inspiring for me to see this next step for us to talk about our really extraordinary, and I think in some respects unique way of taking the things we learn in our network and applying them very rapidly for the improvement of patients and their families. And so this started with the concept of knowledge translation rounds, and here we are. And I'm really grateful. One of the themes is to try to involve our early enthusiastic generation that I'm thrilled about. And so then we have David Lee and Simon Hansom co-chairing tonight. And with that, turn it over to David, who will speak first and get us on our way. So David.
Thanks, Andrew. So I thought I would start off by just saying a little bit about knowledge translation. And first of all, I guess the important thing is, HiRO is a great organization for facilitating research into inherited heart conditions. The research produced by patients who participate in the network and the studies and by the investigators in the network continues to generate new knowledge and be published in peer-reviewed journals. But publication is not the ultimate endpoint of research. So the knowledge needs to be synthesized in the context of our existing understanding of a particular condition and disseminated effectively to knowledge users in the parlance of the CHIR, and so that can inform clinical practice. And because of the Canada-wide scope, HiRO meetings provide a great opportunity for that. These knowledge translation rounds are one of the vehicles that we'd like to help bridge that gap between research output and changes to clinical practice. With that, I'd like to introduce Glenn and Paul, who have a compelling story to share with us before we have our presentations.
Bonsoir, chers chercheurs, chercheuses, care providers, patients, parents, and friends. My name is Paul Cornell, and together with my husband, Glenn, we are quite, it is our pleasure, actually, we're quite excited to welcome you to this first Knowledge Translation Rounds, a new chapter in HiRO's mandate to improve the awareness and understanding of inherited heart conditions for all Canadians.
So our story goes back to 2017. ARVC revealed itself in a shocking and devastating way when our 19-year-old daughter, Alexa, died in her sleep. Subsequent testing discovered that Paul and our other 3 children were all gene carriers of 1 or 2 mutations associated with ARVC. One of the most positive aspects of the aftermath of this tragedy was our introduction to Andrew Cron and the wonderful family of HiRO. We've been really impressed with over many years now how this organization is truly dedicated to the prevention of sudden cardiac death and education and working with families and like Andrew described at the beginning.
HiRO has played a huge role for our family, providing support, answers, and knowledge. And it has also allowed us to realize how many of your families are also affected by cardiomyopathies and inherited heart rhythm conditions. And that as patient, there's a place for us at the table with the researchers and care providers. It's so rewarding to be involved, welcomed, and included in the research and in our care, not only as data or patients, but also as human beings with a story. So thank you, HiRO members, for all that you do to care for us respectfully and helping us to make our families feel better. It is much appreciated.
So as we continue this rewarding partnership, it is hoped that all participants in attendance will find tonight's event useful and worthwhile. Bonne session.
Thank you so much for that amazing introduction and just reminding us why we do what we do. I'm just going to take a few moments just to explain some of the logistics of how tonight's going to work. We've got 4 amazing researchers who are going to speak for around 10 minutes each. 3 of those speakers are going to show you a question at the beginning of their presentation. And we want you to think about that question and the answer to the question while they're presenting to you. And at the end, you're going to have the opportunity to put your answer in a poll, and we'll look at that and ask the speaker just to summarize it very briefly before they finish their presentation. For questions, I'm sure all of you will have exciting questions to ask. We're just going to ask you please to submit those via the chat, and that will give David and myself time to read through those, assimilate them, and then we will put them towards the speakers for you. We're going to divide the Q&A session into 2 sections. So after the first 2 speakers, we're going to have 10 minutes where we will pose questions to those 2 speakers, and then we'll do the same thing again after the last 2 speakers. We're looking forward to this. Hopefully this is going to be fantastic. David, back to you just to introduce the first speaker, please.
Yes, our first speaker is Christian Steinberg. He's a cardiologist, an electrophysiologist, and an inherited arrhythmia specialist. He did his EP fellowship in inherited arrhythmia in Vancouver. He's a staff electrophysiologist at the Quebec and Lung Heart Institute, and he's the director of the inherited arrhythmia clinic there. His research focuses on cardiogenetics and inherited arrhythmia syndromes.
Thank you very much, David. Can you understand? Can you hear me? Is it good?
Very well, thank you.
I do the screen sharing. Give me 1 sec. Wait a sec. It's not working. Screen sharing. Why can't I see? All right. Can you see this now? Right, it's good?
Yeah.
All right, so I have no disclosures. So let's start off with the clinical vignette. So these are the tracings of a 43-year-old otherwise healthy patient who was transferred to our center for syncope related to what was initially interpreted as torsade de pointe. No past medical history. When she arrived at our ER, she almost immediately went into electric storm, required multiple defibrillations, intubation, sedation, ICU transfer. We had a really rough night and hard time to get her stabilized. Once the arrhythmia settled down, she had extensive cardiac workup, which was completely negative, no structural heart disease and no other reversible cause. So with this in mind, these tracings, we will come back to that. The question will be, what is the most likely diagnosis and what kind of antiarrhythmic treatment would you apply? So short couple ventricular fibrillation, or SCVF, is a distinct electrical phenotype, one of the most recent ones that hived off the big pool of idiopathic VF. So idiopathic ventricular fibrillation, per definition, is an otherwise unexplained malignant arrhythmia. And it is not a specific disease. I would rather call it a working diagnosis, because what we've learned over the last 30 years, that different distinct inherited arrhythmia syndromes, primary electrical diseases, hived off this pool. Starting off with the Brugada syndrome in '92, subsequently other distinct phenotypes and diseases were identified in 2008, early repolarization syndrome, and more recently SCVF. Obviously, SCVF has existed forever, and the very first time it has been reported in a very small series of patients was in '94 by Antoine Lehnhardt and his team, when they described this phenomenon of a normal ECG with a onset of short-coupled VF. Back in the days, it was termed short-coupled torsade de pointe. However, it has nothing to do with classic torsade. The problem is that how would you define it? Well, it is a primary electrical disorder without a specific ECG phenotype. The only clinical or electrophysiological hallmark or feature is the VF onset by a trigger PVC with a short coupling interval, for which we propose a cutoff value of less than 350 milliseconds. What is a coupling interval? It is the interval between the QRS onset of the last preceding sinus speed and the onset of the trigger PVC that initiates the VF. Unfortunately, the first clinical manifestation is quite often cardiac arrest or sudden cardiac death. So what is the electroanatomic substrate of SCVF? So there's now good evidence that cells of the Purkinje system of the right and left ventricle are triggers and also substrates to maintain this short-coupled ventricular fibrillation. Over the last years, there have been other small series reporting this phenomenon. However, most of these cohorts were actually quite reported on quite heterogeneous populations. Many of these papers were contaminated by other etiologies such as Brugada syndrome or not yet diagnosed early repulse syndrome. So when we went back and looked at our CASPER HiRO cohort of unexplained cardiac arrest, we realized that there is this distinct subset of patients who have all this unifying feature of the VF onset by short-coupled PVCs. And this subset accounts for at least 7, in a more recent publication, maybe up to 14 of so-called idiopathic VF cases. Unfortunately, we don't really know what the genetic causes in the majority of patients, despite extensive research around that. So, and as you need the documentation of the VF onset, it is actually quite common that many of these patients are diagnosed at the time of VF recurrence, when you can document the onset. These are the ICD tracings of a middle-aged female patient who was hospitalized in our center for unexplained VF arrest, had a negative workup, got an ICD, and in only 48 hours after her admission and the ICD insertion, she already had a recurrent event with an appropriate shock. You can see at the top part of the tracing, this is the endocardial tracing. You see sinus rhythm interrupted by a small run of non-sustained polymorphic VT that is initiated by the short-coupled PVC of 2 with a coupling interval of 260 milliseconds. And then just a few seconds later, a sustained episode requiring a shock below. Once again, this short-coupled initiation. So why did we come up with this cutoff interval of 350 milliseconds? Well, actually, it was the best discriminator when we modeled this to distinguish it from other electrical diseases that can also initially present as so-called idiopathic VF. So at the right-hand side, you see an example, for example, of a long QT patient. These are also patients that can have malignant ventricular arrhythmia, but typically the trigger PVC here just isolated has a very long coupling interval. So what you can see is over 600 milliseconds. So in the average, our HiRO SCVF cohort, it is about 270 milliseconds only. So then how can you diagnose SCVF? So basically, you first have to eliminate all the rest. So when facing unexplained VF, well, you need a stepwise and systematic approach. And what we usually approach across our HiRO centers is the well-established CASPER approach, where we go stepwise using imaging, ECG testing, provocative tests, and try to cross off the list of other differential diagnoses like CPVT, early report, or so ever. And in this context, it is important to know that among those multiple tests we use, there are a few that are better than others. So-called high-yield tests are those tests that have more chances to reveal subtle either structural or electrical abnormalities that might orientate us towards one of the other specific diagnoses. So these triad of cardiac MRI, treadmill stress test, and sodium channel blocker test should definitely be included in the workup. Because the problem is SCVF has electrical features or clinical features that are also shared with other primary electrical diseases like early repolarization, short QT, and Brugada. So what do they have in common? In all of these four disorders, VF is initiated by short-coupled PVCs. The VF typically manifests at rest or sleep, so in a non-adrenergic state, and all disorders respond to quinidine. However, SCVF is the only one that does not have a distinct ECG phenotype at rest. And how do these patients evolve? So it's a very aggressive disorder with a high risk of VF recurrence. In our HiRO cohort, 92% have at least one recurrence in the first 5 years after ICD insertion, and 21% present with an electric storm, most of the time during the index cardiac event. And this is why ICD insertion alone is very often not sufficient. Quite a few of these patients need more management, and our number one treatment, well, the only efficient antiarrhythmic medication is quinidine. Quinidine in these patients is roughly 83% efficient over a period of 4 years. These are our data. Verapamil, there's some evidence, has also some efficacy. And in selected cases, it has already even been reported to co-administer verapamil quinidine. This is a touchy thing and should be done under careful monitoring because of the drug interactions and the risk of quinidine toxicity. And if the quinidine fails, well, then we have sometimes to go a step further. In selected cases, we can also consider ablation of trigger PVCs. This should only be done in centers with a good experience. These can be quite extensive procedures, often require epicardial access, and in particular what you need are frequent, ideally monofocal monomorphic PVCs. So the treatment strategies are also nicely summarized in the most recent ESC guidelines. Well, starting off with the ICD in documented episodes, then in the case of recurrent episodes and shocks, quinidine for long-term suppression is a number one treatment. In the acute phase during electric storm, isoproterenol is the most efficient to quickly settle down things. And in the case of recurrence, as mentioned, catheter ablation may be an option. So the take-home messages for this disorder is it seems really to be a distinct arrhythmia syndrome that accounts for at least 7 to 14% of IVF cases. It's an aggressive disease with a high risk of VF recurrence. Quinidine, however, is a highly effective antiarrhythmic medication. And when you see these patients or have a suspected case, refer them to a dedicated inherited arrhythmia clinic. With this, let's get back to our clinical vignette. So you see these tracings, and what do you think is a diagnosis and the most appropriate treatment? Is it A, long QT syndrome, and we should give magnesium and beta blockers, or B, SCVF, we should give isoproterenol and then quinidine, or is it C, CPVT, we should give beta blockers, or is it D, a Brugada syndrome, and we should again use isoproterenol and quinidine? I guess, David, you will then, do we have a trend or? Wonderful. So,
thanks, Christian. Yeah, I think there's a good trend there. So thank you. I assume everyone's got the right answer. Fantastic. Christian, thank you so much for that presentation. Just because of time, I'm going to move on, if that's okay, and introduce our next speaker.